In today's segment, I'd like to talk about network segmentation. Why is network segmentation important? Recently in the news, you may have heard about some of these recent threats, such as the pipeline ransomware incident. So in networking, you may have heard of the term DMZ. DMZ in the past has typically referred to a demilitarized zone of your network. This would be a partitioned area in which you would put resources such as web servers or email servers or systems that needed to be accessed from the outside of your network, such as the internet. You can think of the DMZ as a partitioned area of the network in which systems are isolated. This isolation provides protection from compromise. So if a system is compromised, the spread can be limited. The term network segmentation has been discussed for many years. However, unless you're a regulated industry, you may find that your network is not segmented. Now, what do I mean by that? That means that if you were to plug in a device into your network, you can essentially access all of the other devices on your network. There is no isolation in place. You can think of a segmented network as having a number of different networks with a firewall in between them. It's common to have several networks. One you might think of as the desktop network. Another one you might think of as the server backbone. You might also think of a wireless network and a guest wireless network. Maybe you'll consider an Internet of Things network, a special network where you plug in all those devices like your network-enabled toaster. I often joke about the toaster because it's one of those types of devices that you may commonly plug into your network unknowingly and not even think about the security implications. So what is network segmentation? You can think of it like having separate, isolated networks for specific purposes. So we often talk about these as VLANs, which is like a virtual local area network. So if you hear the term VLAN, think of it as a virtual separate network. Managed switches have the ability to establish VLANs, and typically you will set up a router or a firewall to route traffic between VLANs. One of the important benefits of that is that you can establish firewall policies that basically institute a rule set or a set of rules between each virtual LAN as to what traffic is going to be allowed. So if you think about this as an example, you may have a desktop VLAN, you may have a server VLAN, and let's just keep it simple there for a moment. So, in a corporate network, you may need to access your file server, you may need to access your Active Directory domain controller. For DNS, looking at internet sites, you need to be able to access the internet. So think of it from your desktop or laptop in the office. You need to access the internet, you need to access your server, and you need to access maybe your printer. Those are the typically common things that you'll access, in a networking environment, in a corporate network environment. So if you think about what that means, back in the day, when we first started networking systems, the intention was to make everything connected. So if you're plugged into the network, you can access everything. And for a long time, that was a great benefit because you can access any system at any time. Now, what that presents in the way of a risk is that every system can access every system. So by having your systems networked, it presents a huge value to your organization. but it also presents a risk. So as an example, if you think about ransomware, if one machine gets compromised, typically what it does is it spreads to all other machines on the network. So that can quickly become a huge problem for an organization. Typically, you'll find a ransomware will impact your organization in the middle of the night when nobody's in the office. It can spread to hundreds of machines in a matter of minutes and will encrypt data across your machines and pop up a message on your screen that says all of your data has been encrypted and your backups have been wiped out, and you now have to pay maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in ransom to be able to decrypt your data. And if you don't have a good solid backup in place, that might be your only choice, or your business may no longer exist. So what we do to protect from this type of risk is we install a solid backup system, right? And you'll see in another segment our disaster and recovery solutions that we offer that help companies recover from these types of scenarios in literally hours rather than days, weeks, or months. However, today I'm just talking about network segmentation. So the servers will be protected, right? Think of them being backed up hourly. If your servers are backed up, that data is protected to a fail-safe appliance. Well, that leaves your workstations potentially exposed. So it may not be feasible to back up all the data or all of your workstations. And some people may choose to do that, but typically it's not done. So there is a risk for the workstations that are unprotected from a backup perspective to being impacted from ransomware. So typically we'll have a solution in place to protect the data on workstations, such as folder redirection or potentially known folder redirection to OneDrive, which essentially means that your files and folders such as my documents, my desktop, my pictures, my photos will all be redirected to OneDrive and synced to the cloud. So let's assume for a moment that all of your data on your workstations, on your laptops, on your servers are all backed up and protected, which would be a great thing to have in place. But let's assume all of that is in place. Now, with that said, imagine a scenario in which you had 150 machines that were infected with ransomware. And there really was no way to remove it thoughtfully, which means you generally have to rebuild each one of those machines, install all the applications, restore all the data on each one of those. It's almost difficult to imagine how much effort that takes, until you've had to do it. So if you think of the working environment during the pandemic, many workers were working from home. They may have brought their work computer home, they may be using a laptop, they may be using their personal computer at home. This presents a whole set of challenges from a security perspective. It's not behind a firewall, may not have endpoint security installed, may not have the typical protections that you would expect to see in the corporate environment. Now, being on your home network without a firewall may present additional risks. You could be in a scenario in which your exposure is greater than being at the corporate location behind the firewall. Now, when someone comes back into the office with a system that is unprotected, or let's say they VPN into the network at the office, they're opening up a channel of communication directly into the network from an unprotected system, potentially. So you might think about this and say, well, what good does network segmentation do if all the desktops can connect to each other? Well, that's a problem. Because the way that ransomware spreads is through what's called lateral movement. So one of the common problems with a desktop VLAN is that every device can communicate with every device. Now, back in the day when we started networking, you wanted everything to be able to access everything. The open flow of communication made, connecting things together very easy. But it also presents a substantial risk. You may have heard the term zero trust. Well, what does that mean? Zero trust means you can't trust any device on your network. So you have to protect all devices from each other. So at a high level, let's think about there being a server VLAN and a desktop VLAN. Think about the servers being isolated in a separate network with firewall policies that are put in place to only allow specific access from specific machines that are authorized. And at a high level, you can think about all of these desktops being connected on the same network. Well, with segmentation in place, this still presents a problem. So you have to think about diving a little bit deeper into the problem. So what we talk about is potentially having in place what we call port isolation. Each of the ports that you would plug into has its own firewall policy associated with it. You can also think about each user when they authenticate on their machine, they're also authenticating with the network. This is commonly described as network access control. So you have to be authorized to be able to access the network. So a common way to implement this would be to designate an onboarding VLAN. So as an example, an onboarding VLAN may be a network that is only allowed to access the internet. It may have some very tight controls in place. So you might think about this and say, well, what good does network segmentation do if all the desktops can connect to each other? Well, that's a problem. Because the way that ransomware spreads is through what's called lateral movement. So let's talk about terminology. Think about north-south being communication in and out of the internet, and east-west being lateral or movement within your network from machine to machine inside your firewall. These assets can be defined and grouped together. So as an example, you might have a baseline policy that says you can access the file server, you can access the internet, you can access printing. That might be the baseline for the general population of users. Okay. Now, you might have a development team that also needs to access the development server. So we typically define groups based on department, and depending on the department that you're in, you may have access to certain shares on the file server. This has been a common practice for years. Now we can think of it as if, based on your department, you may have specific access to specific machines on your network, which could mean a development server, it could mean a scientific instrument, it could mean a machining tool, it may be a printer, it may be a robot. So by implementing this level of security, you can more effectively prevent the spread of ransomware if attack were to occur. So one of the challenges in IT is how do you prevent the spread, right? We have a number of tools that we leverage to protect individual systems, but we also have methods to protect systems at the network level. So at the network level, we want to prevent communication between devices unless they're authorized by policy. So that means that, on the firewall, we will establish policies that allow specific communications internally between specific devices. So if you'd like to learn more, shoot me an email. Let's schedule an appointment and we can talk about designing a network that is more secure,